What if I told you that beneath the floorboards of America's most famous survivalist lies a secret so profound that when federal investigators finally uncovered it, they questioned everything they thought they knew about human survival? What if I told you that this discovery wasn't just about one man's obsession with living off the grid, but about a blueprint for humanity's future that's been hiding in plain sight for over 3 decades? This isn't just another story about a mountain man in his cabin. This is about the moment when the line between genius and madness disappeared forever, buried 10 feet beneath the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. And by the time you finish watching this video, you're going to understand why this discovery has implications that could change how our entire civilization thinks about survival, sustainability, and what it truly means to be human in the 21st century. But before we dive into what investigators found in those underground chambers, you need to understand the man who built them. Because Eustace Conway isn't just some eccentric hermit playing at primitive living. He's a philosopher, an engineer, and quite possibly a prophet who saw the future of human civilization and decided to do something about it. The metal detector's steady beeping suddenly turned frantic. Environmental Inspector Jake Morrison had been scanning the soil beneath Eustace Conway's hand-built cabin for routine foundation stability when his equipment started screaming warnings that made no sense. The readings showed empty space where there should have been solid earth, lots of empty space. Morrison wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cool mountain air. He'd been doing environmental assessments for 15 years, and he'd never seen readings like this. The electromagnetic pulses were bouncing back from depths that suggested a cavern system, but geological surveys of the area had never indicated any natural cave formations. "That's impossible," Morrison muttered, adjusting his equipment for the 3rd time. The digital display continued showing the same impossible data: a hollow space roughly 30 feet across and at least 12 feet deep, starting just 8 feet below the cabin's foundation. Morrison's partner, Sarah Chen, knelt beside him as they marked the anomaly with orange spray paint. She was a structural engineer with a specialty in soil composition, and the readings made her stomach clench with professional anxiety. "How big are we talking?" she asked, watching the detector sweep across a 30-foot radius of consistent hollow readings. "Big enough to hide a house," Morrison replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah, look at this pattern. This isn't natural erosion or a sinkhole. The edges are too regular, too geometric. Someone built this." Chen pulled out her tablet and began documenting the readings with the methodical precision that had made her one of the most respected engineers in her field. But as she worked, a chill ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. In her experience, when people built large underground structures in remote locations, they usually had reasons they didn't want to share with authorities. That's when Eustace Conway emerged from the tree line, his weathered face unreadable as he approached the team. For 30 years, this man had been America's most famous advocate for primitive living, teaching thousands of students how to survive using nothing but their hands and the natural world around them. His Turtle Island Preserve had become legendary among outdoor enthusiasts and survivalists, a place where the modern world stopped at the gate and ancient wisdom came alive. But as he stared at the orange marks scattered across his property, something flickered in his eyes that the investigators had never seen before. It wasn't anger or indignation at the intrusion. It wasn't surprise at the discovery. It was something that made both Morrison and Chen take an unconscious step backward. Fear. Not fear of being caught or exposed, but the deep existential fear of someone who had spent decades preparing for a moment they hoped would never come. The fear of someone who had built something extraordinary and wasn't sure the world was ready to understand it. "Mr. Conway," Chen said, her voice carefully professional, "we're going to need to investigate this anomaly. For safety reasons, we have to determine what's causing these readings." Eustace stood silent for a long moment, his eyes moving from the orange marks to the faces of the investigators, then up to the sky where storm clouds were beginning to gather over the mountain peaks. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades of solitude and contemplation. "I've been waiting for this day for 27 years, he said quietly. "I just hoped I'd have more time to finish what I started." But here's what makes this story absolutely mind-bending. When they finally broke through that first layer of concealment, What they found wasn't just a hidden room or a simple survival bunker. What they discovered was evidence of a decades-long experiment so ambitious, so carefully planned, that it challenged everything we think we know about human adaptation and survival. And that was just the beginning. Because, as federal investigators would soon learn, Eustace Conway hadn't just been living off the grid. He'd been preparing for something much bigger than anyone could have imagined. Something that would force them to redefine what it means to be truly self-sufficient in a world that's forgotten how to survive without technology. The initial excavation took 3 days. Working carefully to avoid damaging whatever lay beneath, the team used hand tools to remove layers of packed earth, decomposed leaves, and carefully placed stones that had been arranged to look natural but were actually part of an elaborate camouflage system. Morrison later described the process as archaeological in its precision. Every layer revealed new evidence of deliberate construction and concealment. Drainage channels carved into the clay to direct water away from the structure. Ventilation shafts disguised as natural root systems. A network of supports and reinforcements that spoke to engineering knowledge far beyond what anyone expected from a primitive living enthusiast. But it was Chen who made the observation that changed everything. As they cleared away the final layer of concealment, she noticed that the wooden planks of the hidden hatch weren't just old, they were ancient. The wood grain, the tool marks, the joinery techniques all pointed to construction methods that hadn't been used in over a century. "Jake," she called out, running her fingers along the hand-forged iron hinges. "This wasn't built recently. This structure is old, really old. But it's been maintained, upgraded, expanded. Someone has been working on this for decades." That's when they realized they weren't just looking at a survival shelter or a storage facility. They were looking at a living project, something that had been growing and evolving beneath their feet for longer than either of them had been alive. Let me tell you exactly what happened when they pried open that first wooden hatch, because what emerged from that 10-foot deep hole wasn't just stale air and darkness. It was the breath of a world that time forgot. The hatch itself was a masterpiece of primitive engineering that would have impressed craftsmen from any era. Hand-hewn oak planks, each one selected for its grain and strength, had been joined using traditional mortise and tenon techniques that created joints stronger than modern screws or nails. The wood had been sealed with pine pitch mixed with beeswax and charcoal, a combination that had kept moisture out and preserved the wood for decades. The iron hardware was equally impressive. The hinges, latches, and reinforcing straps had all been forged by hand, shaped with hammer and anvil, using techniques that most modern blacksmiths would struggle to replicate. But these weren't crude approximations of historical metalwork. They were refined, elegant pieces that combined traditional methods with innovations that improved on centuries-old designs. When Morrison and Chen finally lifted the hatch open, using crowbars they'd retrieved from their truck, the hinges moved smoothly despite their age. Someone had been maintaining this entrance, keeping it functional and ready for use. The air that rose from below was unlike anything they'd ever experienced. It wasn't the musty staleness you'd expect from a sealed underground space. Instead, it carried scents of cedar, dried herbs, and something else. Something that reminded Chen of her grandmother's root cellar, but deeper, more intentional. There was a richness to the air, a complexity that suggested active biological processes, living systems that had been carefully balanced and maintained. "There's a ladder," Morrison called out, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness below. The wooden rungs descended into shadows that seemed to swallow their lights entirely. But even from the surface, they could see that this wasn't a simple hole in the ground. The walls were lined with timber, and the construction extended far beyond what their lights could reach. Morrison descended first, his boots finding solid purchase on rungs that had been worn smooth by decades of use. As he moved deeper into the earth, his flashlight began to reveal the true scope of what lay beneath Eustace Conway's cabin. The chamber stretched out in multiple directions, its walls reinforced with timber that shouldn't have existed. The wood was chestnut, American chestnut, a species that had been virtually extinct for over a century due to blight. But here it was, not just preserved, but actively incorporated into a structure that showed no signs of decay or deterioration. "How is this possible?" Chen whispered, as she joined Morrison at the bottom of the ladder. Her voice echoed strangely in the space, as if the walls themselves were designed to carry sound in specific ways. The acoustic properties of the chamber were unlike anything she'd experienced. Sounds seemed both muffled and amplified, creating an environment that felt both intimate and vast. The chamber was roughly 30 feet across and 12 feet high, with additional tunnels branching off in 3 directions. Every surface showed evidence of careful planning and meticulous construction. The walls weren't just dirt held back by timber. They were engineered, with drainage channels carved into the clay and ventilation shafts that disappeared upward into darkness. But what struck both investigators most powerfully was the sense of inhabitation. This wasn't a storage space or an emergency shelter. This was a place where someone had lived, worked, and thought deeply about the fundamental questions of human existence. But that's not even the strangest part, because as they explored deeper into this underground world, they realized that Eustace Conway hadn't just built a survival shelter. He created something that challenged the very foundations of how we think about human habitation and self-sufficiency. And what they found in the next chamber would force them to question whether they were dealing with a brilliant visionary or something far more unsettling. The first branching tunnel led to what could only be described as a workshop, but unlike any workshop either investigator had ever seen. The space was roughly 20 feet long and 10 feet wide, with a ceiling high enough to stand comfortably. But every inch had been utilized with the kind of efficiency that spoke to decades of refinement and optimization. Along one wall, hand-forged tools hung from wooden pegs driven into the timber supports. But these weren't museum pieces or decorative replicas. They were working tools, each one showing signs of regular use and careful maintenance. Chisels with edges sharp enough to shave with, draw knives worn smooth by countless hours of use, specialized implements whose purposes weren't immediately obvious but whose quality was unmistakable. The workbench was a single slab of walnut that must have weighed several hundred pounds. Its surface was scarred by decades of use but polished to a deep, rich glow that spoke to the kind of craftsmanship that modern furniture makers spend lifetimes trying to achieve. On it lay projects in various stages of completion, wooden bowls carved with precision that would make professional woodturners envious, metal implements shaped with techniques that combined traditional blacksmithing with innovations that improved on centuries-old methods. But it was the lighting system that made both investigators pause in amazement. Instead of electric fixtures or even simple oil lamps, the workshop was illuminated by a network of mirrors and polished metal reflectors that captured and redirected light from the surface through ingeniously designed shafts. During daylight hours, the system provided enough illumination for detailed work. At night, a few strategically placed candles or oil lamps could light the entire space through the same reflective network. "This is incredible," Morrison whispered, running his hand along the workbench surface. The level of planning, the attention to detail, this isn't the work of someone playing at primitive living. This is the workshop of a master craftsman who happens to be using traditional methods. Chen was examining the tool collection with the eye of someone who understood engineering and construction. "Jake, look at these modifications. He's taken traditional tool designs and improved them. This draw knife has a blade geometry I've never seen before. It would be more efficient than anything you could buy today. And this chisel set, the steel quality, is better than most modern tools." But as impressive as the workshop was, it was what they found in the next chamber that truly challenged their understanding of what one person could accomplish using primitive methods. Now, I want you to imagine yourself in that moment. Picture the weight of the earth above your head, the cool air against your skin, the way your flashlight beam seems to get absorbed by walls that have been hidden from sunlight for decades. You're not just hearing about this discovery, you're experiencing it alongside these investigators as they uncover secrets that have been buried longer than most of us have been alive. The second tunnel led to what could only be described as a library, but unlike any library you've ever seen, the walls were lined with shelves carved directly into the clay and reinforced with cedar planks. But instead of books, the shelves held something far more precious: the accumulated knowledge of a lifetime spent learning how to live in harmony with the natural world. Glass jars filled with seeds, each one carefully labeled with not just the plant name, but detailed notes about growing conditions, harvest times, and uses. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the ceiling, their scents creating a complex aromatherapy that seemed to clear the mind and sharpen the senses. Rolls of bark paper covered with detailed drawings and notes about everything from weather patterns to animal behavior. But it was the books that truly revealed the scope of Eustace Conway's intellectual project. These weren't purchased volumes or reprints of historical texts. They were hand-bound journals filled with decades of observations, experiments, and insights written in Eustace's distinctive handwriting. As you run your hand along the leather bindings, you can feel the texture of materials that have been prepared using traditional methods. Hides tanned with oak bark, paper made from plant fibers, inks created from natural pigments. These books represent not just knowledge, but the preservation of the skills needed to create and maintain knowledge without dependence on industrial systems. Opening one of the journals, you're struck by the precision and detail of the observations. Weather patterns tracked over decades, with correlations drawn between atmospheric conditions and plant growth, animal behavior, and human health. Soil composition studies that would impress professional agriculturalists. Detailed notes on the medicinal properties of local plants, with careful documentation of preparation methods and dosages. But beyond the practical information, these journals contain something even more valuable: philosophical reflections on what it means to live as a conscious, responsible member of the natural community. Insights gained through decades of careful observation and deep thinking about humanity's place in the larger web of life. One entry, written in the careful script that characterizes all of Eustace's writing, reads, "Modern humans have forgotten that we are not separate from nature. We are nature. Our health, our happiness, our very survival depends on remembering this connection and learning to live in ways that honor and strengthen it rather than exploit and degrade it." As you move through this underground library, you begin to understand that you're not just looking at one man's collection of survival knowledge. You're looking at a comprehensive alternative education system, a university of practical wisdom that could teach people how to live fulfilling lives without destroying the systems that sustain all life. The silence in this space is profound, but it's not empty. It's the kind of silence that comes from deep concentration, from minds focused on understanding rather than consuming. It's the silence of a monastery or a research laboratory, a place where serious work is being done on the most important questions of human existence. Your footsteps echo softly on the packed earth floor, and you can feel the slight give under your boots that tells you this isn't just a storage space. This is a place where someone has spent countless hours reading, writing, thinking, and planning. The wear patterns on the floor, the arrangement of the furniture, the careful organization of materials, everything speaks to a life lived with intention and purpose. But here's what made the investigators' blood run cold. As they explored this underground library, they realized it wasn't just a repository of knowledge. It was an active research facility, recently used. The ink in some of the journals was still fresh. The experiments documented in the latest entries were ongoing. Eustace Conway hadn't just built this place decades ago and forgotten about it. He'd been using it regularly, intensively. And that raised a question that would haunt the investigation. What had he been researching down here, alone in the darkness for all these years? The evidence of recent activity was everywhere once you knew what to look for. Fresh candle wax on the reading table, recently sharpened pencils arranged with military precision. Food stores that couldn't have been more than a few weeks old. But most unsettling of all were the journals themselves, dozens of volumes documenting experiments and observations that painted a picture of a man conducting the most ambitious research project in modern history. The latest entries revealed that Eustace had been using himself as a test subject in a comprehensive study of human adaptation and resilience. He'd been documenting everything: his physical health during extended periods underground, his mental state during isolation from modern society, his dreams and insights during meditation and contemplation, his growing understanding of what humans truly need to thrive. But the research went far beyond personal experimentation. The journals contained detailed studies of local ecosystems, climate patterns, and environmental changes that revealed a level of scientific observation that would impress professional researchers. Eustace had been tracking the health of the forest around Turtle Island for decades, documenting changes in species populations, soil composition, and water quality, with the kind of long-term perspective that modern science rarely achieves. One series of entries documented his experiments with what he called technological minimalism, systematic studies of how much modern technology humans actually need to live healthy, productive, fulfilling lives. He'd spent months at a time living with progressively fewer modern conveniences, carefully documenting the effects on his physical health, mental clarity, and overall well-being. The results were startling. Rather than suffering from deprivation, Eustace had documented consistent improvements in almost every measure of health and happiness, as he reduced his dependence on modern technology and increased his engagement with natural systems and traditional skills. My sleep is deeper and more restorative when I follow natural light cycles rather than artificial illumination, read one entry. My digestion is better when I eat foods I've grown and prepared myself rather than processed foods from industrial systems. My mind is clearer and more creative when I spend time in focused work with my hands rather than consuming information and entertainment through screens. But perhaps most significantly, the journals documented Eustace's growing understanding of systems thinking, how everything in the natural world is interconnected, how human health depends on the health of the larger ecological community, and how modern civilization has systematically severed these connections in ways that are making us sick as individuals and unsustainable as a species. But that philosophical insight would seem almost quaint compared to what investigators found when they discovered the sealed door at the back of the library. Because behind that door lay evidence of experiments that pushed the boundaries of what one person could accomplish, using nothing but primitive technology and decades of accumulated knowledge. And what those experiments revealed about human potential would change how the investigators thought about survival, adaptation, and the future of our species. The sealed door was itself a work of art and engineering that demonstrated the level of skill Eustace had achieved through decades of practice. Constructed from oak planks joined with wooden pegs and sealed with a mixture of pine pitch and beeswax, it had kept the chamber beyond completely isolated from moisture and contamination for what appeared to be decades. The locking mechanism was a marvel of wooden engineering that would have impressed medieval craftsmen. A system of sliding bars and counterweights that could only be operated from the inside, ensuring that whatever lay beyond would remain undisturbed until Eustace himself chose to reveal it. But the lock also incorporated innovations that improved on traditional designs, refinements that made it more secure and easier to operate while maintaining the aesthetic and functional principles of pre-industrial craftsmanship. When investigators finally gained access to this inner sanctum, they found themselves in a space that defied every assumption they'd made about primitive technology and human ingenuity. The chamber was smaller than the others, roughly 15 feet square, but every inch had been utilized with the kind of efficiency that would make modern designers weep with envy. The walls were lined with what could only be described as a primitive laboratory, but the sophistication of the equipment and experiments challenged everything they thought they knew about what was possible without modern technology. Glass vessels of various sizes contained experiments in fermentation, distillation, and biological cultivation that represented years of careful observation and refinement. Some vessels contained cultures of beneficial bacteria for food preservation, not just simple fermentation, but complex, multi-stage processes that created foods with enhanced nutritional value and extended shelf life. Others held samples of bioluminescent fungi that provided a soft, steady light without any external energy source, living lamps that could illuminate the underground complex for months without maintenance. But the centerpiece of this underground laboratory was a system that challenged everything investigators thought they knew about sustainable technology. Using nothing but gravity, water pressure, and ingeniously designed mechanical systems, Eustace had created a network of devices that could generate power, purify water, and maintain optimal growing conditions for food production, all without a single component that couldn't be manufactured by hand using materials found in the forest. But here's what made investigators question their own sanity. The system worked, not just in theory, but in practice. It had been operating continuously for years, maintaining itself through principles of physics and biology that most modern engineers have forgotten in their rush toward digital solutions. And that's when they realized they weren't just looking at one man's survival experiment. They were looking at a prototype for human civilization that could function independently of every system we currently depend on for survival. The water purification system alone represented a masterpiece of applied physics and biological understanding that challenged assumptions about what was possible using primitive methods. The system began with a series of settling ponds carved into the chamber floor, where incoming water from an underground spring was allowed to slow down and deposit sediments. From there, the water flowed through a series of sand, charcoal, and ceramic filters arranged in a gravity-fed cascade. But this wasn't just a simple filtration system. It was a complex biological treatment facility that used beneficial bacteria and aquatic plants to remove contaminants and add minerals that improved both the taste and nutritional value of the water. The filtered water then fed into a network of channels carved into the chamber floor, creating a circulation system that maintained optimal humidity levels throughout the underground complex. But Eustace hadn't stopped there. Excess water was directed into growing beds, where he cultivated mushrooms and other fungi that could thrive in low-light conditions, providing both food and natural air filtration. The entire system was self-regulating, using principles of natural balance and feedback that maintained optimal conditions without any external control or monitoring. It was a living system that had been designed to work in harmony with natural processes rather than fighting against them. The power generation system was even more impressive, demonstrating innovations that combined traditional mechanical principles with insights that most modern engineers had never considered. The primary power source was a series of water wheels, powered by the underground stream that fed the filtration system. But these weren't simple paddle wheels. They were precision-engineered devices that maximized energy capture while minimizing maintenance requirements. The water wheels drove a network of gears, pulleys, and flywheels that stored and distributed mechanical energy throughout the complex. But Eustace had also incorporated human-powered elements, exercise equipment that allowed him to contribute energy to the system while maintaining his physical fitness. Stationary bikes, rowing machines, and weight systems that had been integrated into the power network, turning daily exercise into productive work. The stored energy could be used to operate grain mills, pottery wheels, and other equipment that made life in the underground complex not just survivable but comfortable and productive. It was a closed-loop system that demonstrated how human activity could be integrated with natural processes to create sustainable abundance rather than scarcity. Now, I need you to understand something crucial about what happens next in this story. What investigators found in the deepest chambers of this underground complex wasn't just impressive, it was revolutionary. It represented a level of innovation and forward thinking that most people would assume requires teams of scientists, modern laboratories, and millions of dollars in funding. But Eustace Conway had accomplished it alone, using nothing but his hands, his knowledge, and materials he could gather from the forest around his cabin. And when you see what he created, you're going to understand why this discovery has implications that extend far beyond one man's experiment in primitive living. The third tunnel led to what could only be described as a food production facility, but unlike anything that existed in the modern world. This wasn't just a root cellar or storage area. It was a comprehensive agricultural system that could produce fresh, nutritious food year-round using nothing but natural processes and human knowledge.
Well, that's an interesting question because we're not really open to the public.
The growing beds were carved directly into the chamber floor and lined with a mixture of clay and organic matter that created optimal growing conditions for a variety of plants. But the sophistication of the system went far beyond simple container gardening. Eustace had created a complex ecosystem that mimicked the nutrient cycling and biological relationships found in healthy natural systems. Composting systems built into the floor processed organic waste and created rich soil amendments. Worm bins produced both compost and protein in the form of edible worms. Mushroom cultivation areas used decomposing organic matter to produce both food and soil conditioning materials. Everything was interconnected, with the waste products from one system becoming the inputs for another. But perhaps most impressive was the seed production and preservation system. Eustace had been conducting plant breeding experiments that would have impressed professional agriculturalists, selecting and developing varieties that were specifically adapted to underground growing conditions while maintaining high nutritional value and flavor. The seed storage system itself was a marvel of low-tech preservation. Using combinations of natural materials like diatomaceous earth, ash, and dried herbs, Eustace had created storage conditions that could keep seeds viable for decades, without refrigeration or chemical preservatives. Each variety was carefully documented with notes about growing requirements, harvest times, and culinary uses. But the food production system went beyond just growing plants. There were areas dedicated to food processing and preservation using traditional methods that had been refined and improved through decades of experimentation. Fermentation vessels for creating preserved vegetables, dairy products, and alcoholic beverages. Smoking and drying areas for preserving meat and fish. Equipment for grinding grains and processing nuts and seeds into flours and oils. The entire system was designed to provide complete nutrition using only resources that could be produced or gathered locally. It was a demonstration that food security didn't require industrial agriculture, global supply chains, or chemical inputs. It required knowledge, skill, and careful attention to natural processes. But the most shocking discovery wasn't technological. It was personal. Because scattered throughout this underground complex were journals that revealed the true scope of Eustace Conway's vision and the decades-long experiment he'd been conducting not just on sustainable technology, but on himself. The journals revealed that for over 20 years, Eustace had been spending increasing amounts of time in this underground world, testing the limits of human adaptation and the psychological effects of extended isolation from modern society. He'd been documenting everything: his physical health, his mental state, his dreams, his insights, and his growing understanding of what humans truly need to thrive. And what he'd discovered would challenge everything we think we know about human nature and our relationship with technology. The psychological experiment that Eustace had been conducting on himself was perhaps the most ambitious and comprehensive study of human adaptation ever undertaken. Starting with short stays of a few days, he had gradually extended his time underground, eventually spending months at a time in complete isolation from the modern world. But this wasn't the isolation of a hermit or a madman. It was the focused solitude of a scientist studying the most important question of our time. What do humans actually need to be healthy, productive, and fulfilled? His observations were meticulous and profound, documented with the same careful attention to detail that characterized all of his work. He recorded how his sleep patterns changed when freed from artificial light and electronic stimulation, noting improvements in both the quality and efficiency of his rest. He documented changes in his physical health as his diet shifted to foods he grew and prepared himself, tracking improvements in digestion, energy levels, and overall vitality. But perhaps most significantly, he noted changes in his mental clarity and emotional stability as he spent more time engaged in meaningful physical work and less time consuming information and entertainment. The journals documented a gradual but profound shift in his relationship with time, attention, and purpose that challenged fundamental assumptions about what modern humans need to be happy and fulfilled. "I am discovering," he wrote in one entry, "that most of what I thought were necessities are actually distractions. Most of what I thought were conveniences are actually dependencies. And most of what I thought were improvements are actually degradations of human capability and satisfaction." The entries revealed a man undergoing a fundamental transformation in his understanding of human nature and potential. As he spent more time living according to natural rhythms and engaging in work that directly supported his survival and well-being, he documented improvements not just in his physical health, but in his creativity, his problem-solving ability, and his sense of connection to the larger web of life. But the psychological experiment went beyond personal transformation. Eustace had been studying the effects of different types of isolation and solitude, comparing the psychological impacts of being alone in natural settings versus urban environments, of engaging in productive work versus passive consumption, of following natural rhythms versus artificial schedules. His conclusions challenged many of the assumptions that underlie modern psychology and sociology. Rather than finding isolation harmful or depressing, he documented how the right kind of solitude engaged in meaningful work within natural systems, could be profoundly healing and transformative. Loneliness, he wrote, is not the absence of other people. It is the absence of meaningful connection to work, to place, to purpose, to the natural world that sustains all life. When these connections are strong, solitude becomes a source of strength rather than suffering. But the most chilling discovery was yet to come. Because in the deepest chamber of this underground complex, investigators found evidence that Eustace Conway's experiment wasn't just about personal transformation or even sustainable technology. It was about preparing for the collapse of modern civilization and ensuring that human knowledge and capability would survive to rebuild a better world from the ashes of the old one. The final chamber was unlike anything investigators had encountered in the rest of the complex. Where the other spaces felt lived in and actively used, this room had the reverent atmosphere of a library or museum. But it was more than that. It was an ark, a repository of human knowledge and capability designed to survive catastrophes that would destroy any conventional archive. The walls were lined with sealed containers, holding what could only be described as a comprehensive backup of human civilization. But this wasn't just a collection of books or documents. It was a carefully curated selection of the knowledge and skills that would be most essential for rebuilding sustainable human communities from scratch. There were detailed manuals for every aspect of primitive technology, from metallurgy and ceramics to agriculture and medicine. But these weren't just copied from existing sources. They were refined and improved through decades of practical application. Eustace had taken traditional techniques and enhanced them with modern understanding of physics, chemistry, and biology, creating hybrid approaches that combined the best of ancient wisdom with contemporary knowledge. The seed bank alone represented years of careful collection and preservation. Varieties of plants that had been selected not just for their nutritional value, but for their ability to thrive in different climates and soil conditions. Many were heirloom varieties that had been largely replaced by modern hybrids, varieties that could reproduce themselves and adapt to changing conditions without requiring external inputs, like fertilizers or pesticides. But perhaps most impressive was the knowledge preservation system itself. Recognizing that books and paper documents would eventually decay, Eustace had developed methods for encoding information in more durable formats. Clay tablets fired in his underground kilns contained essential information about water purification, food preservation, and basic medicine. Metal plates etched with acid held detailed diagrams of his mechanical systems and construction techniques. He'd even experimented with biological information storage, using selective breeding of plants and animals to preserve genetic traits that would be valuable for future generations. It was a living library that could survive catastrophes that would destroy any conventional archive. The scope and sophistication of this preservation project was staggering. Eustace had essentially created a complete backup of the knowledge and skills needed to rebuild human civilization, but a version of civilization that would be sustainable rather than destructive, integrated with natural systems rather than opposed to them. But underlying all of this practical preparation was a philosophical framework that revealed the true depth of Eustace Conway's vision. His journals from this period showed a man grappling with the biggest questions of human existence. What is our proper relationship with the natural world? How can we live in ways that enhance rather than degrade the systems that sustain life? What knowledge and capabilities are truly essential for human flourishing? His conclusions were both radical and deeply conservative. Radical in their rejection of the assumptions that underlie modern industrial civilization. Conservative in their embrace of time-tested principles and practices that had sustained human communities for thousands of years. "We've confused complexity with sophistication," he wrote in one of his most profound entries. "We've mistaken consumption for prosperity. We've traded resilience for efficiency, wisdom for information, community for connectivity. The result is a civilization that's simultaneously the most powerful and the most fragile in human history." But Eustace wasn't advocating for a return to some romanticized past. Instead, he was working toward a synthesis, a way of living that combined the best insights of traditional cultures with the best discoveries of modern science, creating something new that could be both sustainable and fulfilling. His vision was of human communities that could meet all their needs using local resources and renewable energy that could maintain high levels of health and education without destroying the natural systems that sustain all life, that could provide meaningful work and genuine prosperity for all their members without exploiting other communities or future generations. It was an ambitious vision, but the underground complex provided proof that it wasn't just a utopian dream. It was a practical possibility that could be achieved by people with the knowledge, skills, and commitment to make it happen. Now, here's what makes this discovery absolutely crucial for understanding our current moment. Eustace Conway wasn't preparing for some distant hypothetical collapse. He was responding to changes he could see happening in real time, changes that have only accelerated since he began his underground experiments. Climate change, resource depletion, social fragmentation, technological dependence, and the psychological toll of modern life. All of these challenges were already visible to someone who had spent decades observing the natural world and human behavior with the kind of attention that our distracted age rarely allows. And his solution wasn't to retreat from these challenges, but to develop practical alternatives that could serve as models for a different way of living. The implications of what investigators found beneath Eustace Conway's cabin extend far beyond one man's personal experiment. They challenge fundamental assumptions about what humans need to thrive, about what technology should do for us, about how we should relate to the natural world that sustains all life. In an age when most people feel increasingly anxious about the future, when environmental crises seem overwhelming, when social and economic systems seem increasingly unstable, Eustace Conway's underground complex offers something rare and precious, proof that alternatives are possible. His experiments demonstrate that high quality of life doesn't require high consumption, that security doesn't require dependence on fragile supply chains, that human fulfillment can be found in work that enhances rather than exploits the natural world. But perhaps most importantly, his decades of careful documentation provide a roadmap for how these alternatives could be implemented on a larger scale. The knowledge and skills he preserved aren't just historical curiosities. They're practical tools that could be used to create more resilient, sustainable, and fulfilling ways of life. When news of the discovery began to spread through academic and scientific communities, the response was immediate and intense. Anthropologists recognized the value of Eustace's documentation of traditional techniques and their modern applications. Engineers marveled at the elegance and efficiency of his mechanical systems. Psychologists were fascinated by his self-experimentation and the insights it provided into human adaptation and resilience. But perhaps most importantly, sustainability experts realized they were looking at a working model of what they'd been trying to achieve through policy and technology, a way of living that could meet human needs without depleting natural resources or degrading environmental systems. The underground complex represented proof of concept for ideas that most people considered impossible or impractical. It demonstrated that the transition to sustainable living didn't require sacrifice or deprivation. It required knowledge, skill, and a willingness to think differently about what constitutes progress and prosperity. Universities began sending researchers to study Eustace's systems and methods. Government agencies started investigating how his innovations could be scaled up and adapted for broader application. Environmental organizations recognized the complex as a living demonstration of the principles they had been advocating for decades. But the impact went beyond academic and policy circles. As word of the discovery spread through social media and alternative news sources, people began arriving at Turtle Island Preserve who weren't just interested in learning about sustainable living, they wanted to participate in creating it. For the investigators who first discovered this underground world, the impact was more personal and immediate. They had entered the chamber expecting to find evidence of eccentricity or paranoia. Instead, they found themselves confronting questions about their own lives and choices that they'd never seriously considered. Sarah Chen later described the experience as life-changing in ways I'm still trying to understand. When you see what one person can accomplish using nothing but knowledge, skill, and determination, it makes you question everything about how we've organized our society and our individual lives. She began making changes in her own life, reducing her dependence on convenience technologies, learning traditional skills, and spending more time in natural settings. I realized that I had been living in a kind of prison, she explained, a comfortable prison, but a prison nonetheless. Eustace Conway had found a way to be truly free, and he'd spent decades perfecting that freedom and documenting it for others. Jake Morrison was even more direct in his assessment. I went into that chamber thinking I was investigating a curiosity. I came out realizing I'd been living a lie. Everything I thought I knew about what humans need to be happy and healthy was wrong. Eustace Conway had discovered truths about human nature that our entire civilization has forgotten. Morrison began studying traditional skills and sustainable living practices, eventually leaving his job as an environmental inspector to start a homestead where he could apply some of the principles he'd learned from Eustace's underground complex. Both investigators became advocates for the kind of research and experimentation that Eustace had been conducting, arguing that his methods and insights deserved serious study and broader application. But here's what makes this story even more compelling. The discovery of the underground complex wasn't the end of Eustace Conway's experiment. It was just the moment when his private work became public knowledge. Because when investigators asked him what he planned to do now that his secret was revealed, his answer suggested that everything they'd found was just the beginning of something much larger and more ambitious. This was never meant to stay hidden forever. Eustace told the investigators as they prepared to leave Turtle Island, it was meant to be a prototype, a proof of concept. Now that you've seen what's possible, the real work can begin. When pressed for details about what he meant by the real work, Eustace's response was characteristically cryptic but deeply intriguing. One person living sustainably is an interesting experiment. A community of people living sustainably is a revolution, and a network of such communities is the foundation for a civilization that could last for thousands of years instead of destroying itself within a few centuries. The implications were staggering. Eustace wasn't just talking about individual lifestyle changes or even intentional communities. He was envisioning a fundamental transformation of how human societies organize themselves, a shift from extraction and consumption to integration and regeneration. And he had the knowledge, the experience, and now the public platform to begin making that vision a reality. In the months following the discovery, Turtle Island Preserve began receiving visitors unlike any it had seen before. Engineers, scientists, educators, and policymakers came to study Eustace's systems and understand how they might be adapted and scaled. Graduate students wrote dissertations on his integration of traditional and modern techniques. Documentary filmmakers captured his methods and philosophy for broader audiences. But perhaps most significantly, people began arriving who weren't just interested in learning about sustainable living, they wanted to participate in creating it. Young people disillusioned with conventional career paths, families seeking alternatives to suburban consumption, retirees looking for meaningful ways to spend their remaining years. Eustace found himself in the unexpected position of being not just a teacher of primitive skills, but a catalyst for a movement that could reshape how humans relate to each other and to the natural world. The underground complex became a pilgrimage site for people seeking alternatives to the anxiety and emptiness that characterize so much of modern life. But it also became a research center where serious work was being done on the most important questions of our time. How can humans live in ways that enhance rather than degrade the natural systems that sustain all life? What knowledge and skills are truly essential for human flourishing? How can we create communities that are both sustainable and fulfilling? As investigators reflected on their discovery and its implications, they realized that the most important lesson wasn't about any particular technique or technology. It was about the power of sustained attention and commitment to transform both individual lives and broader possibilities. Eustace Conway had spent decades developing not just skills and systems, but a way of seeing and thinking that allowed him to find solutions where others saw only problems. His underground complex wasn't just a survival shelter or a technological achievement. It was the physical manifestation of a different relationship with reality itself. In a world increasingly dominated by short-term thinking, instant gratification, and surface-level engagement, Eustace had demonstrated the profound results that become possible when someone commits to deep, long-term exploration of fundamental questions about how to live well. His example challenged the assumption that meaningful change requires large institutions, massive funding, or technological breakthroughs. Instead, it demonstrated that transformation begins with individuals who are willing to question basic assumptions, experiment with alternatives, and commit to the patient work of developing better ways of living. Today, the underground chambers beneath Eustace Conway's cabin remain largely as investigators found them, a testament to what becomes possible when human ingenuity is guided by wisdom rather than mere cleverness, when innovation serves life rather than just convenience. But the real story isn't about what was found beneath the floorboards of a mountain cabin. It's about what that discovery revealed about human potential and the choices we face as individuals and as a species. Eustace Conway spent 30 years asking a simple question: how should humans live? His underground laboratory provided one answer. Not the only answer, but a compelling demonstration that alternatives to our current path are not only possible, but practical. The question now is whether the rest of us have the courage and commitment to explore those alternatives before the systems we currently depend on make the choice for us. Because as Eustace Conway proved in the darkness beneath his cabin, the Earth is still willing to teach us how to live sustainably and fulfillingly. We just have to be humble enough to listen, patient enough to learn, and brave enough to change. The discovery beneath Turtle Island wasn't just about one man's remarkable experiment. It was about the future of human civilization and our species' potential to create a world that works for everyone, including the generations yet to come. And that story is still being written, one choice at a time, by people who refuse to accept that the way things are is the way they have to be. The underground chambers beneath Eustace Conway's cabin stand as proof that another way is possible. The question is, what are we going to do with that knowledge?